My presentation is titled, Does Academia Matter to the Shaping of Mutual Perceptions in South Asia? And the brief answer to the question should be quite obvious. You know, it should. It should matter, but does it? In its current avatar, I think South Asian academia contributes very little to the shaping of informed mutual perceptions about each other. In the reason because of its very poor quality. If you think the latter conclusion is a bit too harsh, please join me in the following thought exercise. If you are a fellow Nepali, think of a single Nepali academic who you would call an India expert. Expert here being defined as a researcher who specializes on studying and writing in any one of the academic formats about some aspects of Indian polity or society. I can't think of even one such academic Nepali expert based in Nepal or anywhere else in the world. If you are in Bangladeshi, think of a single compatriot who you would call an Indian expert. If you are a Pakistani, please join me in the same exercise. If you do not like this version of a thought exercise, you can ask a slightly different question. For instance, if you are an Indian, ask yourself if you know a fellow Indian sociologist or an anthropologist or a historian who spent 6 months or a good part of an academic 12-month period in any of the countries of the region in the last 20 years. You know, historians, sociologists, anthropologists from India. I don't know anybody from this discipline who spent, as I said, I've lived in Nepal continuously since late 95. I don't know a single Indian academic who spent any bit of good time of this nature in Nepal. If your answers are different than the ones I have come up with, I would like to hear about them. And as I said, I'm willing to stand corrected. However, I suspect your answers are not different from the ones that I have come up with, zero. In other words, I suspect there is no such experts in our academic communities and serious research from any of the social science disciplines from any of our countries in any of the other countries with serious physical presence as a researcher. It's simply not happening. If my answers are correct, then we need to reflect on the lack collectively and patiently and take steps within our possibilities to redress this. I'm not an expert on South Asia as such. I will give you examples of two sort of how is Nepal studied in India, how is India studied in Nepal, or how is India not studied in Nepal. And that is actually the body of the work that I've recycled for this paper. If you want the full version of that, full article length version of that, please look at Onta 2001, which is in the citations of the text that circulated. This version is 10 pages, single space. The mother version is about twice as long. Okay. Now let's just do the first step. How is India studied in Nepal? The best answer was given by a Pakistani scholar, Dr. S. Akbar Zaidi, when he was writing in the pages of EPW in 2009 an article entitled "A Conspicuous Absence: Teaching and Research on India in Pakistan." He began that article by saying, in many important ways, there is not much of a story to tell. I could just simply repeat that line and say, how is India studied in Nepal? There is not much of a story to tell. It's not. There are no programs to study in India. If anything, given the influence India has on the politics of Nepal and the society of Nepal, one would have thought that would have been the primary objective of anybody thinking about academic planning in Nepal. Unfortunately, in the late 80s or the mid 80s, there was a small initiative started within what is now known as the Center for Nepal and Asian Studies within the oldest university in Nepal, Tribhuvan University, founded in 1959. SINAS, this center was founded in the early 70s. There were some efforts by the late Kumar Khadga Shah, brother-in-law of the late King Birendra, to start an initiative in area studies in Nepal. It lasted for about 5 years. When Shah retired from SINAS in 1989-90, that initiative died. And so there's virtually nothing to tell you about how India is studied in Nepal. I was told just 10 days ago that there is now an effort through I believe the initiative of at least somebody in the Indian embassy in Kathmandu to start again perhaps an effort within Tribhuvan University to start something called India Studies Center. I have no further details on it, but given the mess in which Tribhuvan University exists right now, and I want to be very specific about what I mean by mess. It is Tribhuvan University today has many brilliant social scientists working for the institution, but the university itself is perhaps beyond redemption. It's one of the largest public universities in the world. You might not realize this. It has 60 constituent campuses, and it has about 900 institutions to which it has provided affiliations. The entire enrollment makes Tribhuvan University one of the largest universities in the world. But it's this hybrid nature of a public university, largely providing affiliations to almost 900 private institutions, has created a monster that nobody knows how to fix. So many of my colleagues would stand up in podiums like this, and they'll have a plan on how to restructure Nepal, but they don't have a sentence on how to restructure Tribhuvan University. I've often asked them, why can't you run a regular seminar in your department? And they are likely to tell you how to federalize Nepal, rather than say, we can't get into it because either the department head won't allow me to run a seminar, or there's no budget for it. No, in other words, as an institution, it's doomed. There are many brilliant individuals studying it. I'm done with that. How is Nepal studied in India? And Dr. Muni might feel like I'm telling the story of his life, because two of the institutions where he spent most of his time are institutions where Nepal studies. He was trained in Jaipur in the Regional South Asia Studies Center in Jaipur in the late 60s, early 70s. And then he worked for a very long time at the School of International Studies in JNU. And much of the better good stuff on Nepal has come out in the past from those two places. Nepal is also studied from a small Center for Nepal Study that's part of the BHU University, Banaras Hindu University. And these are primarily the three institutions which have produced a whole bunch of, the quantity-wise, it's great. There's a lot of writings on Nepal. So the traffic between Nepal and India is virtually, unidirectional, in the sense there's a lot of people who've studied Nepal from India, virtually no one doing it the other way. If you read this paper, even the shorter version I provided to the conference organizers, you'll see two or three things. Most of these studies have been produced by people whose disciplinary homes have been political science, IR, and diplomatic history. Some of the very big works produced by the first generation of post-independent scholars, produced brilliant works on diplomatic history between India and Nepal, occasionally India, China, etc. That work is great, both for the scholarship quality it maintained and for the analysis that it presented. In later years, we've seen many repetitions along the same kinds of domains of scholarship. But as I said, I don't know of a single sociologist who spent any time in Nepal, anthropology same, political scientist same, so in the last 15, 20 years. What that suggests to me is that the Nepal that becomes visible from Indian scholarship in Nepal is a very narrow spectrum of politics, diplomacy, etc. Much of the best work on Nepal is now produced by anthropologists who do work on Nepal, who are located in Nepal, in many countries in Europe and in the US, some in Japan, some in Germany. I cannot recall a single Indian scholar who cited any of the good work that's come out from this whole anthropological work in Nepal and has engaged with that work. Not citation in the mercenary sense of citation. We can always cite because you can download a whole list of things online these days and just cite them without having read them ever or engaged with them ever. Okay? What's happened is that regional studies in India was started in somewhat derivative sense of the area studies program in the US, which predates the one in India by only a decade. But then they were also allowed to anguish, and to quote the very interesting language of the current director of CSDS, Rajiv Varga, we have a tendency in our regions to start institutions, and then we have also a tendency to let institutions remain in a way in which they are neither alive nor dead. That's all. That's institutions, the visionary statements are great, but the money that's needed to actually run an institution simply doesn't show up. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when I did research on these area study centers, I found out that many of the centers, for instance, the center at BHU, funded by the UGC in India would require, if you read the text, it says 1 professor's salary, 1 reader's salary, 2 lecturers' salary, money for libraries, money for conferences, and a big back of the envelope hisab. I mean, accounting would suggest that that would run to about, in 2000, would about 10 lakh Indian rupees, 1 million. Now, obviously, the professor salaries have gone up since then, but at that time, that particular center was getting less than half of that required money. Obviously, therefore, designated positions were empty. Libraries had stopped buying things from Nepal, and the center was neither alive nor dead. Money, a lack of it, and a commitment to actually pursue a very a landscape in which the institutions within academia that are supposed to actually do the things that they were created to do, it's not been the greatest story in the region. And I think there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that the story in any of the other countries in the region is any different from what I've said. If I, as I said earlier, I am standing here not to be correct. I'm standing here to be corrected if my evidence is poor. Just to read some stuff from my text, generating quality Indian scholarship on the rest of the region is not very high in the agenda of Indian formal academia programs. And as stated above, current scholarship is dominated by disciplines such as political science, international relations, economics, and somewhat dated state-centric model of area studies. Now, if that's the story for our formal institutions, mostly located within universities and UGC centers, what's the story with Track 2 and SARC and South Asian academia? As I said earlier, I mean, this is also a trajectory in which I've really not participated. This is 3 minutes to 15, right? 20. Oh, okay. I'll be very brief. To my knowledge, I'm also reading, to my knowledge, no foundational texts have emerged from these networks. This is the Track 2 networks that I'm talking about, simply because we lack a regional research imagination in our collective civil society at large. This lack manifests itself in repeated cycles of conferences and seminars for which money seems to be available on this or that theme with South Asia in the title, obviously. But in our collective inability to design and carry out region-wide serious research with involvements over several years of researchers in many of the countries, many of researchers in many of the countries of the region. 15 years ago, I was very hopeful. Today, not very. Both the media doesn't demand this scholarship. The media has been reduced to its, mainstream media has reduced to our collective jingoistic element and a shouting match. Between the two of that, there is absolutely no demand for quality scholarship. If this is a kind of a dismal story that I've shared with you, what should we do? Yeah, we should not simply attend these conferences. If these conferences are going to be useful at all, these conferences should give birth to networks of serious folks who want to study not only the region, but also think about its politics. We should go back and say, if any of the things I have shared today, we should go back and think very seriously about why the state exists in this very dismal state. And for countries that have not commissioned studies regarding their own status of area studies on each of the countries of the rest of the countries in the region, we should demand that such studies be commissioned. It would also, if we do these studies, it would enable us to call upon our governments, regional organizations, and international agencies to better support long-term regional research initiatives and not regional junkets. Because, as I said earlier, a lot of donor agencies seem to have money for conferencing, not for serious research. Given the political and academic morass in much of the South Asia, the chances that fresh investments will be made for South Asian studies in our countries within our collective effort are very small. I want to, Dr. Muni, when Dr. Muni published his first book on Nepal, I was in primary school. Every time he comes to Nepal, there's a lot of rubbish written about him in our semi-literate print media. But I want to highlight the fact that 40 years after his first book, if he is still the primary Nepal expert in India. It speaks volumes for his staying power, but poorly for Indian scholarship on Nepal. Thank you.